to be very clear, I'm a diversity and inclusion training expert. And also, I know a lot about unconscious bias. I have a PhD in philosophy, and I was teaching critical thinking for many years, both at Western, but also that's the company I started, Dialectic. We were sort of bringing scientific insights from the cognitive sciences and applying that to everyday decision making for people in organizations. So today I want to talk to you about diversity and inclusion e-learning and driving change in the COVID-19 aftermath. And I'm going to start with an activity here. So Ryan is smirking. I meant it as a compliment, he says. Zahida was surprisingly articulate. You roll your eyes. Sure, but you've never called me articulate. Your coworkers have all left the Zoom meeting, and before you sign off, you say, and then you asked her where she was from. Well, what's wrong with asking people where they're from? Ryan replied. You hesitate, not sure whether to bite. Well, it's just something I bet she gets asked a lot, you said eventually. And when she said Thornhill, you didn't need to press the issue. Well, if it bothered her, she would have said something. You're always overreacting about things like this. Stop making such a big deal out of nothing. So being confrontational with Ryan about his microaggressions doesn't seem to be working, and you need to try a new approach. So what would you do? Here are three options. Encourage him to ask your coworker Min Soo to explain. Try to get him to look through the impact or think through the impact of his comments from Zahida's perspective, or come up with microaggressions against him to help him understand the impact. So I want you to just think to yourself, like, which one of these would you do? Now, and we'll come back to it later. So we know, want to talk about diversity and inclusion training because of COVID, but of course, we can't talk about this without also recognizing the large social movement that's happening right now with Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd incident, and just this seismic shift that's sort of happening in our societies around anti-Black racism and just in general diversity and inclusion. And so everything I'm going to say today also can apply to these sorts of things that are happening. And what we're sort of seeing is there's actually, because of COVID, we're seeing an expansion of inclusion and equity. So because people are working from home, that's a new form of exclusion or an opportunity where issues of inclusion can be exacerbated. We're seeing the impact of mental health because of COVID. We're seeing, practical things like the quality of your internet can affect whether you feel included or are included in conversations. And in that connection, if you're not good at managing video conference technology, or again, your internet connection is bad, that's another form of exclusion. So what's happening is that on the left side, we have here what are traditional, and there's just a snapshot, there are a lot more, but traditional categories of inclusion and equity. And I've highlighted racialized persons here because that's particularly, that's just become really magnified over the last month. But then on the right side here, you have these things like working from home, mental health, rural internet, video conferences, and a whole host of other new considerations as a result of COVID, at least during this period where we're in lockdown, and may continue on as people work from home longer. So the key to any diversity and inclusion strategy is really generating empathy at scale in your organization. That's the key. If people can start to see other people's lives through their eyes, and if people can really start to understand the forms of discrimination and prejudice that they experience, that is the key to moving forward to a place that's more inclusive, more diverse, more equitable. But how do you build this empathy when you're working remotely? And when working remotely is part of the problem. Our internet connection literally is a barrier between us right now. It's really hard to empathize with other people. I just saw My team, we just got together the other day in a backyard, and it was like, well, both figuratively and literally, they were three-dimensional again, and it made a big difference. And so it's really hard to see people um, and really generate that empathy when you're working remotely. So how do you do that? We need to do it, especially because of Black Lives Matter, but also because of COVID. So how do you do it? Well, e-learning is a perfectly suited technological solution to this. Um, you can deploy it remotely. Good e-learning is done on mobile now. It's self-paced, so people can work through it by themselves and in an asynchronous way. So when it works for them, and you don't have to do it all together. It's repeatable, so you can use it for onboarding. It's scalable. As we know, it can go to as many people as you need. And generally, the total cost of ownership is lower. But you have to do it right. Any old e-learning is not going to work. And the unfortunate thing is that the way people are designing e-learning in general, and specifically with respect to diversity and inclusion, is that they're basing it on a bunch of intuitions about what good education looks like rather than science. The good thing is there is good science out there to say how to do this correctly. It just has not shown up in the methods that people are using. And so in these 15 minutes I have with you today, I'm going to show you here's the intuitions that are driving bad e-learning, bad diversity and inclusion training, and here's a few scientifically based principles that you can use to do this better. So here's the intuition. If people want to do diversity and inclusion training through e-learning, they think that a single e-learning module of awareness-raising information will improve equality and inclusivity at my workplace. And so there's kind of three elements that I'm going to talk about using 2 points today, but that single e-learning module is the answer, and that awareness raising about information is the answer. So let's look at these in turn. A single e-learning module works. So we know that big companies like Starbucks and Sephora have shut down their operations over the last year to do one-day diversity training. Now, we get to hear that they're doing this because it's a good PR move, but we rarely get to see inside the training room. But if we were to see inside it, this is what it would look like. Someone standing up in front of a projector talking at people, for an hour or half day. And no one's learning anything from this, unfortunately. And what we've done when we go to design e-learning for diversity and inclusion is that we impute all of these intuitions about good training. People think that a speaker talking at people is good training. It doesn't actually do much. And then when we go to do e-learning, this is what we do. We do a virtual instructor in front of a virtual whiteboard teaching virtual bullet points. Everybody in this room, in this Zoom call, has sat through really bad, clicky e-learning modules that you just bang through the content and then go do a quiz and you're done. And you're supposed to have learned something, and none of us have learned anything. So if this isn't the answer, why isn't this the answer? Well, this is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. It's a empirical result that actually that Ebbinghaus was the researcher. It was around the turn of the 20th century, but it was replicated in 2015. And this on the y-axis is just retention of information, and on the x-axis is time. And you can see that an hour after leaving a in-person or a e-learning module of information, you've already forgotten 60% of the content. So we know this doesn't work. But our intuition is to do it like this because that's how we were taught in schools and in lectures. So if that's not the way to do it, what is the way to do it? Well, the science says that spacing learning out over time is the way to keep skills active and to actually have people retain information and retain skills. And all that space learning is to say, if you had an hour's worth of e-learning module content, take that, chunk it into 10-minute segments, 6 10-minute segments, and space it out over time. And the empirical research shows that you'll get better learning outcomes if you do that. Same content, just a different way of delivering it. And it works. And the reason it works is that every time you hit, this is the forgetting curve, every time you hit them with a new piece of content, that forgetting curve gets pulled up to the top again, right? It doesn't mean it doesn't decay, because that's just how the brain is, but this is how you keep it active. So very simple principle. Take whatever you have, chunk it into small bits, space it out over time, you'll get better learning outcomes. You'll actually see better performance. You'll see behavior change. So that's the first. And the second piece, and the last piece we're going to look at, is that D&I is a kind of information about which we need to raise awareness. So I would say, the diversity and inclusion 1.0 was about raising awareness, but D&I 2.0 is about behavior change. It's actually also what Black Lives Matter is saying. They're saying, enough with the talk, let's do something, right? So what's the problem with thinking about it this way? Well, the first is that information is actually subject to interpretation. So that scenario I gave you at the beginning of this, we don't, Zahida, your colleague saw your comment, right, as a way of othering Zahida, saw it as a bad thing. You saw it as harmless. And Zahida saw it probably like she's seen it 50 other times when she's been, when she's had microaggressions against her, right? So it's subject to interpretation, and that in that way makes it really hard to base any of our training on information alone. And so really the way you want to think about D&I training is that D&I is a kind of habit that we need to practice. It's not a kind of information we need to be aware of. It's a habit that we need to practice. And this is a basic habit model, right? You have the trigger or a stimulus. You then have a routine, that's the habit, and then you're rewarded, and that keeps going round and round. So we've seen this with police brutality, right? So what happens? Well, when they're called to de-escalate a situation, their brains are in crisis mode. And when your brain is in crisis mode, you're not thinking through things in a logical way, you're just responding out of habit. And if at the base of your habits is a set of harmful stereotypes and prejudices, that's what gets activated in those situations. So we know from the Human Rights Tribunal report that black men are 20 times more likely to be involved in a fatal shooting by Toronto Police Services than white men. So that's because when they get into these crisis situations, there are these harmful habits that are at the root of their cognitive abilities. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to develop new habits. And in that way, D&I training needs to be sticky. It can't be just information that you learn and then walk away and do nothing. It's got to be something that stays with you. We have to really drive this into the back of our brain, so to speak, right? Get that unconscious response moving in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction. That's what unconscious biases are. They're at the root. They're these ingrained beliefs that generate these deep-seated habits. We need to change those. So we need to put someone in a situation that's like the situation in the real world, where their old habit might get triggered, and give them an opportunity, give them a new off-ramp, right? Give them a new routine to activate, and then reward that new routine. And slowly over time, you're going to change the habit. The best way to do this is through scenario-based learning. So it's repeated practice of authentic situations that require D&I action. That's what's going to get you the change in behavior. So we need to, I like to think of scenario-based learning as the flight simulator for unconscious bias, right? So when we have to train a pilot who's in a high-risk, a job, we don't put them in front of a PowerPoint and teach them how to fly a plane. What do? We put them in a flight simulator. We simulate the real world for them, have them make mistakes in a safe environment. And in that way, through repeated practice, prepare them to fly the real plane. And that's exactly what scenarios are. Let's put people in real D&I scenarios and have them respond to those and give them the consequence of that in the real world, right? When they answer something, so I gave you a scenario-based activity at the beginning of this session. And the idea is, when you choose one of those options, I don't tell you whether it's right or wrong. I tell you what happens in the story, because that's how we learn in the real world, right? A situation arises, you make a choice or you do an action, and then the world plays out in a way that it plays out, and you reason consequentially about whether that was a good thing to do, a bad thing to do, whether you'd change your beliefs or behaviors next time. A sign doesn't fall down from the heavens asking you a quiz question. But that's how we're doing e-learning right now. And it's repeatedly practicing those scenarios that's going to get this new habit. So how many times in his life did Kawhi pretend the clock was winding down and throw up a last second shot? Many, many times, right? And then he did it. He was able to execute it in the moment. So the last thing I'll say about practice is that if we waited, so I gave you that example of the microaggressions. So if we said, no, I'm gonna practice this in real life, right? Well, that's fine. That can work, but it might take 3 years to see enough microaggression situations in your life and respond differently or reflect on them enough to change it. But if I served you up a bunch of scenarios around microaggressions that were high fidelity and related to real life, I can turn those 3 years to getting up to expertise into 3 months, because I'm spacing out those practices just over 3 months. And it's a safe environment, so no one's put at risk. So, and then, sorry, this is the very last thing I'll say about it, is you don't need any gimmicks other than really high fidelity scenarios to generate engagement in learning. Because engagement comes from meaning. When people see that something's meaningful to them, they will engage with it. And the best way to generate meaning is relevance. So serve up high fidelity, real life scenarios to them, and they will engage because they'll say, oh, this solves a problem that I actually need to solve. I'm very interested in this. You don't need to bolt on any gamification. You don't need to do any quizzing. You just need to serve up meaningful scenarios to people that they can see themselves reflected in. So we started with this intuition. A single e-learning module of awareness-raising information will improve equality and inclusivity at my workplace. And the scientific way of going about designing training for D&I is spaced practice of D&I habits will improve diversity and inclusivity at my workplace. You can take the same content you have, turn them into scenarios, chunk them into small bits, and serve them up over a long period of time, and you're going to get a shift in inclusive behaviors in your organization. And so that's how we can start to drive higher levels of inclusivity, especially around these categories that have just come on board because of remote work. E-learning is perfectly suited to doing this, but we just have to do it the right way. We've developed a platform that does this. It's called Diversity and Inclusion Learning Snippets. You can go to learningsnippets.ca/EO, try 3 of them for free. They're built on the latest evidence from D&I. They're built on the latest learning science that I've already gone through. And we're seeing a ton of success with the program right now. We just released a free campaign on anti-Black racism, so you can also sign up for 3 of those and send them to anybody you want. And earlier we did ones on COVID, actually, around mental health. We partnered with some social workers to get some quick mental health help out to employees. So that's all I have for you today. I'm happy to take questions, and thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Aaron. That was a ton of information. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I do. Is there answers to the scenario of the 3 different options?
Yeah,
overall?
well, yeah. So it is that scenario is one of the free ones on our Inclusivity 101. So if you go to the site
Oh, it's
and
a
sign
teaser.
up, you'll get them, and you can go through and you can check out the answer. So if you
Cool.
go to learningsymbols.ca/eo and just sign up there, and then boom, it'll land in your inbox, and over the next 3 days, you'll get one. That one will come, and two others will come.
Oh, cool. Nice.
Yeah.
What's I would sorry if anyone else has any questions. What do you think is I don't know if you see it all at all, but what do you think, or in your experience, what's been the most sort of common mistake or assumption or things that you've seen in the workplace, in and around Ontario or Canada? I feel like a lot of times we think we're immune here or not as bad as the states, quote unquote. Like, how would you respond to that and say, what's things that we're not seeing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of systemic racism. We're just sort of having the courage to have that conversation now, I think. Um, I think that for a long time, people of color in organizations have faced forms of discrimination that, yeah, that are largely invisible to people other than them. They see it. They have to work twice as hard to advance half as high in their organizations, and we just that unconscious element of bias when you're on the other side of it is a daily. I think it's a daily occurrence, and they're just so used to like they're not they don't accept it, but it's become part of just navigating their careers, and it's quite sad. And I think it's time to make those types of changes. I think I don't know. I think there's an attitude in Canada, at least, that we want to address this, and we're focused on addressing it, but it is here. I think that maybe for me is the distinguishing characteristic in the States. I think there's a lot of people who want to change it in the States, but there's a lot of people who it feels that don't, and there's more of an uphill battle there for whatever reason. So yeah, so that's been my experience in talking to people of color and other minorities, and other intersect people who face forms of intersectionality. Just um, yeah, in doing our research, it's pretty rampant.
So, as leaders and owners of organizations, what would be like the best first thing or like first step to take if this isn't something that's necessarily been top of mind or you just
Yes,
haven't necessarily implemented something quite?
yeah. Well, I think like the thing. There's kind of four dimensions of good D&I strategy, the way I think about it. You've got kind of on the highest level, you've got your purpose, right? Those are your values. And, it's not enough to just put your values on your website. It's like, how do we do this on a daily basis? How do we live this? The next level down are your policies, right? So what do your HR policies look like? What do your hiring practices look like? What do those systems look like? So that's sort of a more systems level, and that's where that systemic racism sort of emerges. The next level down is what I call practices. So those are things that are like, how do we actually conduct interview for new hires? How do we conduct our employee reviews? How do we choose people for promotion? These are like the practices that we do on a daily basis. And then you've got at the lowest level the people, and that's what are the hearts and minds of this organization? What do they think? What do they experience? How can we affect that? And so changing people's minds is the hardest, but a really important first step is to sort of start to create. How could you create? I like to think about it as could you shift everybody an inch and imagine everybody in your organization just shifted a little bit? That would create actually a huge shift in the whole organization. So to me, you know, place to start is review your practices and policies, right? Like and just ask yourself, where might there be forms of discrimination and prejudice in the way we do these things? Just ask yourself that question of your HR. You know, it really starts with HR. What do our HR practices look like? And you might find some spaces in there like, oh, okay, we can do this better. Or like, how are we, talent management's a big source of prejudice, right? Like, and there's all these hidden forms. Like, if we do job fairs, are they job fairs that are accessible to lower socioeconomic people, right? People who are in a lower socioeconomic class. Like, where are you doing those events, for example? Stuff that we don't even think about that just come from a place of privilege, right? Um, and then I think the other thing is there are some really quick wins you can get with training, but you really have to do it right. And that's what I'm trying to impress upon on you guys today is there is a good way and a bad way to do training. And the one thing we know from the empirical work in D&I is that the only way, so there's been people have made a really big fuss over that unconscious bias training can backfire. Well, the only way it backfires, so goes the science, is that if you frame it in a way that shames or blames people for having unconscious bias. And unfortunately, this is kind of how people do it. They get a speaker, keynote speaker who kind of admonishes people for having unconscious bias. Not like explicitly, but it's in the messaging. And it's not going to work. You have to frame D&I as a collective opportunity. And if you do that and you create an open, trusting, compassionate, caring environment for people to talk about this, you'll see a shift. And then the other thing is to do it just small bits over, it never ends, right? Small bits over a long period of time. And that's what we're trying to do with snippets, is make that super easy. Small bits over a long period of time. That's how you change people's habits. That's how you change people's beliefs.